You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 17th of November 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Tom Edwards. Coming up on today's programme, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is meeting his French counterpart Macron in Paris today. We'll be in Paris for the latest, and Monocle's Julia Jen is here in the studio. Julia, what's Kiev looking to get out of this?
So we've just heard the news. A deal has now been signed for 100 Rafale fighter jets.
More on that with Julia and our Simon in Paris coming up later. Then Monocle's senior correspondent Fernando Augusto Pacheco will take us to Belém in his motherland for the latest on how Brazil can squeeze some soft power value out of Cop30.
Lula feels at home in events like this. He's a very incredibly charismatic guy. And one thing you have to say about Brazil, we can talk to any country on the table.
More from Faye on the way. And Monocle's Grace Charlton will also be here to preview the year ahead in fashion. Is the outlook set fair? We'll be finding out. All that and more ahead here on The Briefing with me, Tom Edwards. A very good afternoon to you from London to this Monday edition of The Briefing. Good evening, good morning, wherever in the world you are. We start with the news that Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is in Paris today to secure French air defence help against increasingly lethal Russian drone strikes. Simon is on the line from Paris, our bureau chief there in the French capital, and alongside me here in the studio is Julia Jen. Actually, Julia, I'll start with you because, as you just mentioned right at the top of the show, big breaking news about this really significant boost to Ukrainian air defences. Tell us what's been happening just in the last hour.
Zelensky's there with Macron. They've just signed this deal, so it's a letter of intent. Ukraine will buy 100 Rafale jets, so these are French-made jets. And this is part of sort of Zelensky and Ukraine's push to really get Ukraine a really good arsenal of fighter jets. But also, as you said, we've got these SAMP-T air defense systems. So these rival US-made Patriot air systems, which are kind of seen as the golden sort of example of amazing air defense in the world. But actually, French SAMP-T air defense systems, they actually rival those in latest trials, in the very, very latest trials from November, against specifically Russian Iskander missiles. And, you know, we've got Russia really ramping up their campaign against Ukraine. We had strikes last night in the Kharkiv region. We had an incredibly enormous strike on Kyiv over the weekend where a drone literally slammed into a block of flats, just straight dead on, you know, and luckily no one was in the apartment at the time because they'd gone down to the air raid shelter. And we've even got Russia putting into serial production cab bombs. So these are bombs that have, they're aerial guided bombs. They have very low accuracy and they normally recently have been reaching just, you know, frontline areas, but they can reach all the way now to Kyiv, apparently, according to the latest intel for Ukraine. So, you know, Zelensky really there shoring up Ukrainian defense, specifically with French-made weapons, which really have been shown to perform very well on the battlefield.
Well, we'll come back to some of those aspects in a minute. Simon, let me bring you in here. Good afternoon, I should say, first of all. Tell me a little bit. There was certainly, it was telegraphed that there were going to be some announcements today from the French side on this. Julia's filled in some of the blanks for us there. What's the view where you are about this step up, both in quality and quantity of particularly air defences to Kiev? How's it being reported where you are?
Well, Tom, I think that the air defense and air warfare in general is really the name of the game in this war. And I think that President Macron's 8-year effort to try and build something that he's been calling the Europe of defense is taking shape. And I think this is probably the most concrete commitment to making that happen, whether he can bring with him the other members of the EU. And I think it's just the manifestation really of this will to support Ukraine and this opportunity really that they have to kind of make sure that there is a European response to this Russian aggression, and that the departure of the United States from its traditional role of supporting Ukraine, the reluctance of the Trump administration to make any kind of security guarantees, to continue supplying Ukraine with the weapons and ammunition that they need. I think this is a very significant step in the direction of trying to replace that step by step. But there are very significant challenges, Tom, to delivering these 100 aircraft over the next 10 years. That's the deal. The kind of headline numbers are impressive, but the logistics of delivering on this is a different matter.
Well, and Simon, just quickly, in terms of how, what's the word, sort of apolitical it is, the support of Ukraine's campaign in France, we have spoken so much about domestic political travails and the difficulty of moving an agenda forward, certainly in economic terms, domestically. Does Macron still have a relatively free hand, and that is still qualified, in terms of continuing to support Ukraine? As you mentioned, sort of Europe-wide support, it kind of waxes and wanes. But is the French position on this reasonably clear, and does he still have room to manoeuvre to get deals like this done? Is it sort of popular, in quote marks?
I think so, Tom, because it means jobs. I think the question is Dassault Aviation, which makes these Rafale, is Thales, are there hundreds of subcontractors going to be able to ramp up their production capacity fast enough to supply all of this equipment in the timelines that were indicated? But at the end of the day, this is money in the bank for France and its industrialists. So there are some voices, obviously, who or advocate for a less forceful response or less forceful support to Ukraine, less military or less spending on the military. But it's a question of to what degree are we going to ramp up the defense budget rather than is it a good idea to do it? France has already been over the past 8 years, as I said, on an upward trajectory when it comes to military spending. I think there is a pretty broad consensus in the political class that a trend should continue. I think President Macron is not going to get everything that he wants, in the sense that the ramp up that he has stated is his ambition is another doubling of the defense budget compared to a baseline from a couple of years ago. I don't know that in the current budget situation that's going to happen, but the trend is there, Tom. I don't think that's going anywhere.
Julia, let me bring you back in here because it's interesting. Zelensky is obviously, he's the very picture of pride. It's good that he's got a deal done. But to the point that Simon alluded to there about turnaround and how quick, making jets over a 10-year cycle, the need is obviously very urgent. He said it will be the greatest air defence, one of the greatest in the world. Do we know any detail about whether these are purchases, transfers from existing stocks? How quickly will we see existing air defence in particular supplemented by some of this? Or again, do we still need to come back to that same old question, which is that actually it's the US as the key critical strategic provider of support that Ukraine still needs to win around? Do we know yet?
So I think we don't really know yet. We don't know the details. This has just come out. One question that would be interesting would be, would some of this actually theoretically be used by the frozen Russian assets that are currently sitting in Europe? And people are really saying this should be used for Ukraine to buy weapons from Europe so that both parties are benefiting. And they're really, making use of that money in a clever way to benefit both parties. But I think also, in the next few hours, Zelensky is going to sit down for a briefing from Dassault, and he's also going to be sending representatives to be talking to French defence firms. So we've got Ukrainian defence firms, French defence firms, government officials sort of pairing up to have these joint discussions. And actually, we've already seen the fruits of some of this labour already. So you've had a French startup that sent a drone wall to Ukraine, which is now going to be used in an undisclosed region. This just came out in the last few days. The drone wall, that's something everyone in Europe has been talking about. And a French startup has really stepped up, managed to come up with some really interesting drone interceptor kind of weapons. And these will be trialled in Ukraine. And I think the important thing for Europeans, here, is that actually there is this ingenuity on the continent, and it's about channeling it in the right places. And actually, we've seen France as such a hotbed of all these kind of defence tech startups, like that example I just shared. And Ukraine really taking that on and really bringing that that defence tech onto the actual battlefield, so that European firms can really see how do the weapons work, can we fine tune them. I've had conversations with defence tech firms. We've got Portuguese Techova, for example. They've said how invaluable it is, that experience of actually putting the defence tech on the battlefield, so you can fine tune it, constant iteration, so you can constantly make it better. And the Europeans need it, because we've had over the weekend mysterious drones. I wonder where they could be from. Circling around. We had Denmark's Aalborg airport that was shutting down for a few hours again over the weekend. They've been targeted, but we've got them over military bases across Europe, including in France. The Europeans need this, anti-drone weaponry, for example, which comes into air defence, because that is such a massive part of the Russian assault now on Ukraine.
And hugely useful, as you say, to have this proving ground of real life conflict and further evidence. There are countries, there are businesses, there are whole sectors that can step into a bit of the vacuum that the US has left behind. Now, it's interesting. I was chatting with Simon there, Julia, about Macron getting to sort of do these deals on the international stage, very different dynamics in terms of domestic politics. Let's just quickly alight within Ukraine, of course, this big corruption scandal. We've discussed it on this programme before. We can't just chase the headlines. What's happening or not in terms of that scandal and how it is being discussed and prosecuted back home?
Yes, so this is a scandal about an embezzlement scheme of up to $100 million. This is being done on Ukraine's energy sector, and we've had 2 cabinet ministers resign over this, and a lot of pressure on Zelensky at home, domestically. So we had one Ukrainian MP, Yaroslav Zhelezniak, who said that Zelensky's approval ratings have plummeted by more than 40%, so down to below 20%. So we can see that, internationally, he's on this pedestal, he's signing these defence deals, etc. But actually, in Ukraine, the picture is much more complicated, and we have this really intense pressure on him to keep his cabinet in check and to keep good advisors around him, so that he can really lead the country in as powerful a way, as strong way as possible. And that domestic pressure is really piling onto him to actually just go through his sort of list of advisors and cabinet ministers. And really, there's lots of eyes on Andriy Yermak, who we've talked about a lot on this programme, his closest advisor, and really sort of clean the ranks a little bit and give other people, opposition leaders, for example, create sort of a unity cabinet, a unity government, which lots of countries have done in wartime. As I've said, we had here in the UK in the Second World War, we had opposition leaders stepping up to fill the ranks in government. And so I think there's a lot of pressure going on right now in Ukraine for Zelensky to sort of pivot the country back onto the right course, make sure that people's lives are being protected, and really get the right leadership in.
Fascinating insights, Julia. Thanks for making sense of that for us. That's Monocle writer and Ukraine expert Julia Jen. Thanks too, of course, to Simon Bouvier, our Paris bureau chief, joining us on the line from the French capital this Monday lunchtime. Plenty going on as the clock ticks through to 13 minutes past midday. Let's cross over to the other studio. Anita Riotta is standing by with the day's other news headlines.
Ousted Bangladeshi Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina has been sentenced to death by a war crimes court. The former leader has been found guilty of commanding lethal force be used to suppress student protests in 2024, which resulted in up to 1,400 deaths. Spain's deficit is set to fall below that of Germany for the first time in 2 decades. Spain's deficit will fall for the 5th year in a row, aided by sustained growth and higher tax revenues. The reversal of the 2 countries' fiscal paths seems to be mirrored throughout Europe, as former crisis countries like Italy and Greece are on better fiscal trajectories than the historically stable countries France and Germany. And more Japanese firms are relaxing rules on employees' appearance, including acceptable hair colors, makeup, and nail styles. The move comes as an increasingly tight labor market is forcing smaller companies to compete for workers. Those are today's headlines. Back to you, Tom.
Thank you very much indeed, Anita. We'll have more news for you at the top of the next hour, 1300 here in London, 1400 if you're on CET. Now, the United Nations Climate Conference, Cop30, is entering its second week in the Brazilian city of Belém. Negotiators are still wrangling for a deal, but in the meantime, Monocle's Chris Chermak caught up with our senior correspondent, Fernando Augusto Pacheco, a little earlier to get Faye's impressions of the conference so far and what it means for Brazil, even if not as many key world leaders are attending as in years gone by.
There's been highs and lows. I mean, the number of world leaders in Belém this year was much lower than in the previous COPs. In some ways, it's not Brazil's fault. I think the world is in a different place, right? And I think the problem is some of the world's biggest polluters, let's think about the US, China, India, their leaders were not present at COP. So in this kind of different world, of course, it's quite strange because, of course, we don't have the final document of COP, but without those countries, I mean, not much will happen. We have to be realistic. But having said that, I mean, I'm sure that President Lula is trying his best, because there's been some positive news about the environment in Brazil. I always like to say that the deforestation levels have been the third lowest recently since data began in 1990. So, it's not all doom and gloom as well.
And what's interesting about that, I guess, is that you talk nationally, deforestation in Brazil is at lower levels, so that's a positive. But there is also the local side to this, where Brazil is shining a light on Belém itself. And this was also bit of a question going in maybe about how it would do. There are now some questions as well, security and other things. How has Belém done?
Well, I think the security one is a very serious one. It's been quite a breach, for such a conference. Some protesters, they went say, listen, we're not being represented here. Sure, and I think they have the right to protest. And I think that's been one good thing about Belém compared to the previous ones, which have been hosted in slightly more authoritarian countries. So, for example, even outside Belém, there's like a lot of events outside the main COP. So that's positive in my opinion. But I mean, it shouldn't happen, COP protesters invading the conference, especially when you have world leaders attending. The UN wrote a letter to President Lula and to the government kind of heavily criticizing that. And I mean, we must talk a little bit about the infrastructure. Listen, Belém's a tropical city. I mean, there's been tropical rain. Some things have been done quite last minute. So that has also been one of the lows. But it's a fantastic city. It's very unusual for Belém to host such a big event. They have their own folkloric events, music events and other, but not an international one in this category. So in some ways, it's been good to put a spotlight on a city that not many foreigners know in Brazil.
And we do want to get to some of the cultural aspects as well. But before that, to go back to the national level for some of the more positives, what have you made of Lula in this moment? Particularly, of course, his one biggest friend in the world, perhaps, is there Emmanuel Macron. How have the two of them done?
The bromance is still very much alive. I think Macron for a while was a little bit jealous of President Trump because Brazil and US...
I know, he gave, Trump and Lula hugged. I don't know how Macron felt about that.
But Lula feels at home in events like this. He's a very incredibly charismatic guy. And one thing you have to say about Brazil, we can talk to any country on the table. We don't have massive disputes. We can talk to Russia, we can talk to China, we can talk to the US, we can talk to France, indeed. And it's been quite cute seeing Lula with other leaders. I think the president of Mozambique is a very tall man, and Lula, a bit much shorter, I have to say. And he was kind of pretending he was jumping, to talk to him. So there's been warm moments like this, and I think that's very good for Lula's image as well.
And you did mention that Brazil gets along with most countries. That doesn't necessarily mean that those countries get along with Brazil. I am thinking of the US in particular here. But there was a moment Brazil's foreign minister met with Marco Rubio last week. Are the relations, do you get the sense, you did also mention Lula and Trump had a bit of a moment, are the relations improving again?
I think there's optimism among Brazilian business sectors, that, of course there's optimism. Listen, I don't know how many months ago, I think it was quite tragic. I think Brazil had the highest kind of tariff rates in the world at some point. Even though I did say, and we have to be, clear about that the US is a very important partner to Brazil, but it's not the only one. I don't think our economy is kind of that much US dependable compared to a country like Mexico, for example. But I think the situation after this meeting with Marco Rubio, after the warming up of relations between Trump and Lula, I think there's some excitement. We don't have all the details yet, and as you know, Trump is a very unpredictable man. We'll have to wait and see.
And just finally, to go back to the city of Belém, we talked about this on the Global Countdown last Thursday as well, Fernando. The divas of Belém, you have coined this term.
Yes.
The musicians, the cultural scene of the city. This has also played a role, though, at the conference. Tell us about that.
Yes. All the divas of Belém. I wrote a piece for the Monocle Minute. We did a special Global Countdown with some of their music. They've all been present somehow at COP. They've been posting about it. Some of them have sang. Fafá de Belém, which is an iconic singer from the city, was singing at the opening ceremony. Joelma, which is one of the best-selling singers, and I love. People should see her videos dancing. It's incredible. She's been posting about the Amazon and how everybody's proud that their culture are being promoted abroad as well. And Belém, besides the divas, which I love, one thing I forgot to say, açaí, the berry, the very famous Brazilian berry, that's from Belém. So one of our most famous food exports is from that city as well. And now açaí is so commonplace. You walk here in London, it's selling everywhere. That's from Belém. One that is not so famous yet is the jambu. I think I mentioned, if you eat too much jambu, your mouth gets numb. You have to eat with care. Okay, not with care, with caution. But could be the next big thing from Brazil.
That was Monocle's Fernando Augusto Pacheco in conversation with Chris Chermak a little earlier. You're listening to The Briefing here on Monocle Radio. 21 minutes past midday here in London, and we're wrapping things up by casting an eye on the world of fashion. McKinsey's released its report on the state of fashion for 2026, noting it's a year when the rules change as tariffs introduce economic volatility and consumer priorities continue to shift. Well, for more on this, I'm delighted to say we're joined now for a regular review of this sector by Grace Charlton, Monocle's Associate Editor for Design and Fashion. Hello, Grace.
Hi, Tom.
Now, what are some of the key takeaways? It's always interesting, I think, when you get these kinds of reports. It's a good moment to drill down a little bit more forensic detail. Broad optimism, some measured confidence. What's the headlines?
Just a little bit of confidence, not too much. We're moving past uncertainty and going towards the stage of grief, which is accepting volatility. I think that's the main takeaway from McKinsey. The US tariffs have completely redrawn the sort of trade maps, but there is some resilience in Europe, China and the US, a little bit of improvement after a lot of creative resetting, which means hiring new creative directors and creating a lot of buzz around fashion again.
And what about, it's funny, whenever we have looked through sort of economic prism at almost any sector, the rise and the rise of skepticism about artificial intelligence continues to loom large. And I guess in this sort of sector, are we getting any indication that whether it's consumers or the practitioners themselves, the big maison, are they indicating that they are better equipped to manage a fast-changing, technologically evolving landscape? Or is it too early to say almost?
I mean, it's probably too early to say always, but no, apparently AI is sort of coming in to save the day in terms of boring stuff, like routine tasks and logistics and shipping. And we're talking about a creative industry. These are not people who want to spend time on spreadsheets. So I think AI is sort of helping that. It also means that the workforce is being culled down a little bit. But I think we'll see how it actually affects the industry in a few years.
And I wonder if this is, and probably just from anecdotal evidence, Grace, conversations you have, I mentioned just at the top there about consumers pivoting. We're seeing that there's a different set of criteria in terms of how consumers are looking to allocate their funds. They want to spend their budgets, whether they're extensive or more limited, in pursuit of other goals or in accordance with other priorities. And I guess it must be interesting to see how the industry is taking that imperative on board.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think what's interesting from this report specifically is that they mention wellness being more of a sort of area that you invest in, which is funny because it's sort of an intangible thing, although you can buy lots of gadgets and procedures and whatever. And then jewelry is one of the sort of rare green shoots in the industry that's shot up. And apparently that is like one of the fastest growing sectors in luxury. But I think what's really interesting is, and they mention it in the report, is this need to foster brand loyalty and the, brands creating campaigns and really amping up their narrative, for lack of a better term. I think when you're hiking up prices, but you're not necessarily hiking up the quality of a product, that's how you get people to spend their money. But I also noticed in this report that they said that mid-market brands are doing quite well. So I'm talking about like Totem or La Mer, these brands that sell coats which are maybe like £1,000 instead of £6,000. It's still expensive, but it's not as, out of the realm of possibility than a lot of these fashion houses are offering,
Well, and just quickly on that, I guess if we go to the Maison themselves, because it's interesting that this is a sort of an industry-wide report. It's very headline, very macro. If you drill down into the details a little bit, we're starting to see some of the big Maison report. And again, it's a similar picture. Green shoots. It's not overconfident by any means. It's not super optimistic, but pragmatic. And I'd say broadly upbeat. Grace, is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. In October, LVMH and Hermes reported substantial growth. And then Burberry, exciting for us because we're based in London. It's a London-based house, reported a first 2% increase in sales for the first time in 2 years. So it's huge. And they actually, going back to what I was saying earlier, they had a phase under Jonathan Ackroyd when they sort of hiked up the prices and tried to be really ultra luxe, but they didn't deliver on quality. And now they've got a new CEO called Joshua Schulman, who used to be at Jimmy Choo and Coach. And he sort of put down the prices again and really focus back on the basics, which are like trench coats and scarves and like the smaller luxuries. And people are really resonating with it, especially Gen Z. And I think it's because they've got amazing marketing campaigns where they've really dialed up the kitsch and whatever they're doing on Instagram. I get targeted ads constantly from Burberry, and it's just a bit of fun, and it's not as, ridiculously priced.
I think you speak good sense there. Light touch and a focus on the storytelling. Okay, look, we're journalists. We would like it. But you need to have a potent narrative that takes people by the hand, gets them a bit excited, right? That's a good lesson for 26 if we're looking ahead.
Exactly.
Grace, excellent. That was a good roundup. That's our Grace Charlton looking at that McKinsey report. We'll probably be discussing that in more detail across the output here on Monocle Radio. But that is all we have time for on this Monday edition of The Briefing, which was produced by Anita Riotta, researched by Joanna Moser, and our studio manager was Christy O'Grady. My thanks to them one and all. We'll be back tomorrow at the very same time, noon London, 1300 CET. But from me, Tom Edwards, and the team, goodbye and thanks for listening.